Welcome back to a brisk morning, Lucore Automotive Services. My name is Richard, and today we're working on the Dodge 4x4 van. It is back. We had some problems with the original engine. I took it all back apart. You can actually watch those videos in the links above. We pulled the engine down, checked it over, really didn't find anything wrong. Ended up sending the block out to the machine shop, checked taper wear, and ended up finding that we had excessive taper bore in 2 cylinders. So it was too far gone for us to reuse that block at that bore. So we sourced a new block, had it machined to the correct bore. So we have fresh rings, bearings, gaskets, timing chain. Basically all the consumables were replaced. Different engine block. It's all reassembled and it's ready to go back in the van. So I'm going to pull this thing in the shop, get it racked up. We're going to pull the motor out, pull the loaner motor out, and then put his engine back in. So let's get to work. It's cold outside. I need to get inside anyway. Click like, subscribe, leave us a comment below.
Is he just here for an inspection? Or?
No, I gotta put the other engine back in it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Why is he getting a new engine?
This is the loaner engine I stuck in it to figure out why he was having such bad oil vapor problems.
Huh.
Because it was just excavating engine oil out the valve covers. It's like, well, something's wrong. So we pulled it apart and we figured out that the taper bore in 2 cylinders was way out.
Gotcha.
So more than likely, when it was bored 30 over originally, they probably mixed up 5 and 7 wires and it fuel washed those cylinders when it was being broken in. So it just eroded them out prematurely.
Huh.
That's my theory.
So you stuck that engine in there and said, "Hey, go drive."
Yeah, go drive around while I figure out what happened on the other engine. So
that was very kind of you.
It was very kind of me. I thought so too.
I know.
I'm very generous. I'm glad I was able to figure out what the problem was without any major distress. But yeah, all my welds have held. You had this part of the frame reinforced. I would have done it differently, but it is what it is. The frame actually failed. It wasn't my weld that failed, it was the frame tore.
Right.
So.
Wasn't he like in the middle of BFE Canada?
Yeah, he was in Canada. He was like 7 hours north into Canada. Yeah. But he found a good welding shop. They did a good job. Well, let's stop staring at it and start taking it apart. Start with disconnecting the battery. got my motor back. I don't really have that much to switch back over. Coil, carb, hoses, wiring harness. And then he gets all his stuff back. With a fresh block. And pistons and bearings. All that. Now I gotta find a Chrysler to drop this thing in. So I can get rid of it and not have it sitting around the show. So I'm fighting with this power steering a little bit, but engine, transmission, drive shafts, everything's back in the car with the new engine block. So my loaner engine has been removed. His engine and his components are back in the vehicle. I'm going to get this power steering hooked up, and then we're mounting and balancing some tires he supplied. But one of them wants like 12 ounces of weight, and we rotated on the wheel and still wants 12 ounces of weight, so we asked him to bring us another tire. So we'll see if that happens. And then we'll just keep moving along. Hopefully I'll be firing this thing up today. I've had it, it was dropped off last Friday. I didn't get to it on Saturday. So I started on it on Monday and getting it going back together. I've had a few hiccups along my week, but we're trying to get this thing running today and hopefully return it to the customer today. So I'll keep whittling away. Really about all I have left is carburetor and carburetor linkages to swap over from the old engine and get this power steering hooked up. And there was a transmission cooler leak, transmission cooler line that was leaking, so I may take a minute and fix that while I'm in here. But first, I gotta get this stupid power steering puppy, which is fighting me. Oh, there you go. Bolts. So sometimes it's really frustrating working on cars because things pop up that you didn't know about or you weren't told about or you just didn't expect to find. So this van was driven in here on my loaner engine that I had installed for the customer, and seemed to run all right. I mean, I fired it up, drove it in the shop, didn't really think anything of it. And I'm trying to break in a brand new engine to basically seat new rings into the new board. And I'm cranking it over and it keeps spitting fuel out the carburetor, which is weird. I'm like, man, what did I do? What's going on? Do I have the timing wrong? I don't know. Something's going on weird. And I'm sitting there watching the carburetor drip fuel out of the rear trumpets. And I'm like, well, that's a problem. So right off the bat, we call the customer and tell him, hey, we need to look into your fuel system because there's a problem. And he said, well, yeah, I know there's a problem with the carburetor. It's always had a problem. And I'm like, well, that would have been nice to talk about before we dropped a fresh engine in for break-in, because I would have liked to figure out what's wrong with the carburetor before I destroy the brand new rings on the brand new cylinder walls. Luckily for me, I'm not doing a camshaft break-in, or I would already be pulling this engine back out of the truck to replace the camshaft with a flat cam lobe, because you have to get the engine to fire up and run right away. So I'm sitting there looking at the fuel just pouring into the rear float bowls, and I'm like, well, let's pull the carb apart. So I pull the carb apart, and it's full of sand and dirt and grossness. Basically, this thing needs a new fuel system. It needs a new fuel tank. It needs new fuel lines, and it needs new fuel filters. Basically, everything in the fuel system in this truck needs replaced. Now, we had been discussing putting fuel injection system on this car, and at this point, I'm not willing to install a fuel injection system on this car because the entire fuel system will need to be replaced to make the fuel injection system work correctly. If I just put a fuel injection system on this, the fuel injection system will get plugged with the same grit that the carburetor is getting plugged with that's coming out of this fuel tank. So for the time being, I'm going to clean the needles and seats in this carburetor and clean out the float bowls to get all the garbage out of them. I'll put a new fuel filter on it, and then hopefully I can get the car running so I can at least park it outside, and then we can make a decision on what the customer wants to do with it from there. So, carb cleaning time. Alright, so I cleaned out my rear bowl, and I pulled the needle out and cleaned the passages. So I'm going to pull the spark plugs out because this thing was dumping a bunch of fuel down the cylinders. I'm going to pour some oil down into the cylinders to help the rings seal and help lubricate the rings as they break in, since they've clearly now been fuel washed. I haven't really cranked it over that much, so it probably won't be a big deal, but I don't want to exasperate the problem by firing those rings up freshly fueled and dry. So we'll see if I can get it to fire up, and after I pull the plugs back out of the car, I've already verified and re-verified my timing. My distributor should be pretty close to where it needs to be. Pull the plugs, throw some oil in it, put the plugs back in, put it back together, crank it over. Frustrating. So, doesn't look like I have any coolant dripping out the bottom. I figured out that I was a dummy and I put the distributor wires on incorrectly, because even guys that have done it 100 times still make mistakes. It is what it is. I've got that fixed. So let's get this thing fired up and see if we can make smoke. I couldn't remember if I tightened my fan blade bolts. And I'm like, I can't remember if I did that. I better check. That would be bad. Nope, they're tight. I got it. Alright, all my vacuum caps are on. Get my timing light, set our base timing. Not one of those trouble-free days. It is what it is. Had a stressful week, made a few mistakes. Now I've overcome those obstacles. It's time to move forward. So my alternator's making a lot of noise. I'm gonna retension the belt. It's probably gonna need an alternator put on it. But I'm not sure if he'll pay me for that. Gonna let this cool down. I'm gonna go get some lunch, and then I'll fire this back up and do all my double checks. Take it for a test drive, and then we'll drive it for about 100 miles, and then we'll change the engine oil out of it, and then we'll drive it another 400 miles, and we'll go from there.
Winning.
Winning! Some of y'all had asked what's inside this van, so thought I'd show you. Got a little sleeping quarters, a place to put stuff, and more places to put stuff. I think he's working on doing some insulation in it, because this thing's got to be hot as Hades, being a black van out in the sun, but I'm sure he will get around to that. Got some wood and insulation on the floor. Got the swivel bucket seats in there. You probably can't see that, but that's all right. It's pretty cool inside. Well, that about wraps up my session with this van. So, what did we learn? We learned a lot of things. We learned the engine I installed in it was either machined incorrectly, or possibly it was getting fuel washed, giving a taper wear to the rear cylinders. That's probably what happened. This fuel system is full of dirt and grime. When I put my new engine into this thing, I was cranking it over, and my fault, I had the timing messed up. Once I sorted that out, I crank it over, and the back bowls were just dumping fuel into the engine. So I'm like, well, that's not good. So I pulled the carburetor apart, cleaned out a bunch of dirt and grit, probably coming from the fuel tank, even though the customer had the fuel tank red coated at another shop before this thing came to me. So there's a whole bunch of dirt in this fuel system, and it's contaminating the carburetor, causing fuel control problems. Because of that, I will not install a fuel injection system on this van right now, because his fuel system needs to be replaced with all new components. That way we know we're not going to contaminate a brand new fuel injection system. It also needs an alternator. His alternator is making noise, so it's going to need replaced. With the future plans of going to fuel injection, I recommended he get at least a 110 amp alternator put on this thing, which would be a special alternator for this setup, probably from Power Master or Speedway Motors, or pick your place to get parts. Jegs, Summit, the local parts store. Anyway, so yeah, there's still a couple things that need sorted out on the van. I think I have all of his oil leak issues resolved. I did end up fixing a transmission cooler line leak up front that was washing trans fluid all over the underside of the car, preserving it, so to speak. But that was annoying me. Everything I touched, I was covered in slime. So I fixed the transmission cooler leak. We don't have oil being pressurized out of the crankcase, out of the valve covers and whatnot anymore. That problem is solved. My compression's good. I I've got hot tubes on all my headers. It's looking pretty good. So now it's time to cut this thing loose again to the customer. We did install 4 brand new Falcon Wide Peak ATs on this van. So I just test drove it. Feels pretty good, as smooth as that aggressive tire is gonna feel. Should do them pretty well. I don't really know what else to talk about. If you guys have any questions, post them below and we'll answer them. It's a pretty neat little van. Built it a couple years ago. Over 20,000 miles have been put on it since it was built. Basically, we now have a fresh bottom end in it, fresh bore, fresh rings. We reused all the other components except for the consumables, rings, bearings, gaskets, seals. Put a new roller timing set in it as well, because the one that was in there was stretched, probably because the thing kept running out of oil. So yeah, here you go, Chris. Come get your van. Go put another 20,000 miles on it. Have fun doing it. Have a great day, guys. See you later.